much, Chris, and I'd like to say, as other speakers have said, how pleased I am to be on this platform. I think what is represented here on this platform, and it goes back, I think in all of our instances, right back 10 years to the start of this war, is a very, very important coalition, an important coming together of different strands of opinion, all of us united in opposing the war in Afghanistan. At a time when we thought it might be very difficult to do, at a time when there was a huge wave of sympathy and opposition to what had happened in New York, and people thought it might be impossible to get together more than a very, very small number of people to campaign against the war, but we did do that. We did campaign against the Afghan war, and then we went on to campaign over Palestine, over Iraq, most spectacularly in 2003, as Tony said. We didn't stop the war, then on Lebanon, and then through to Gaza, and now to Libya. But it's worth going back to that first war in Afghanistan, because we were told in 2001 that this was a war which was about capturing bin Laden. We now know that that has been done, and yet the war still goes on. We were told it was about bringing peace and justice to the world. We were told it was about ending terrorism. All of the things that they said it was there to do have actually got worse in the last 10 years. And that includes the war itself. If you remember when it ended in November 2001, an easy victory for the Americans and their allies, and we were told then that this was the end of the war, that there had been hardly any casualties on the invading side, although of course there had already been 10,000 people, Afghans, who died as a result of that war. We were told this was the end of the story. And for several years, that's what it looked like. But since 2006, this war has been accelerating, it has been growing, it is becoming worse and worse. And therefore, when you hear David Cameron and Barack Obama and the other politicians who say that really the war is kind of winding down, it will be over in a couple of years, that the troops will begin to withdraw, all the other things that you hear, exactly the opposite is going on. In the last year in Afghanistan, there have been 3 times as many aerial attacks as there were in the year before. And this is quite deliberate policy brought about by David Petraeus, the general who's in charge of the forces in Afghanistan, who's moving on in a couple of months' time to a job promoting peace and democracy as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. This was a man who quite deliberately said he was going to escalate bombing of civilians, and that is why more and more civilians have been killed. You don't hear about it in this country, you do not see it on the BBC, but there have been many, many demonstrations protesting at the airstrikes, protesting at the killing of innocent people. These are going on a weekly basis, and they are fired upon and attacked by the Afghan police and army and by the occupiers as well. This is a fact of life. When you look at what is going on in Iraq, the British troops have gone from Iraq, but the Americans haven't. They're supposed to be going, but surprise, surprise, the Iraqi government is asking them to stay for a longer period of time because they will not give up the occupation. And now we have the bombing of Libya. Bombing which is accelerating, which is clearly the idea this had anything to do with humanitarian intervention. It is everything to do with imposing imperial power on the region, and it is everything to do with regime change. There is absolutely no pretense now by the British government or any other government that it is about anything else at all. So we have a situation 10 years into the war where the wars are getting worse, and they're spreading as well. Again, we were told Iraq would be winding down, Afghanistan would be winding down, where else would it happen? But as soon as people have tried to stand up for their rights anywhere in the world, that's when you find that the imperialists intervene, and that is what they are doing in the Middle East today. So, therefore, there is more reason than there has ever been for us to be involved in building this movement. But there's another argument I would like to include here, which is the cost of the war. You see, we're now living with a coalition government which tells us that we can't educate our students for free, that we can't have publicly funded schools, that we have to privatise more and more of the National Health Service, that we can't build houses for people who need them, any of those things, and yet they are spending, on Libya alone, they are spending £38 million a week on that war, and that is rising. They think by autumn of this year, it will have cost, in 6 months, it will have cost £1 billion. Now that is £1 billion that could be spent, leaving aside the very good arguments against why we should be bombing a country like Libya, but this could be spent on the sorts of things that people in this country really need. We've already spent $20 billion on the wars since 2001. It is estimated that the war in Afghanistan is costing £5 billion a year and will cost $20 billion by the time of the next election. So there is also this huge question of what the money is going for. How is it that we live in a world where many people don't have enough to eat, where people don't have homes, where they don't have a decent living standard? How is it we live in a world where we can't find money to help them? We can't find money for the poorest people in this country where inequality is growing, and yet we can find money for every war that they want to have. And don't kid yourself that there's another one. Don't kid yourself, if there is another war coming along, just like with Libya, they will find the millions of pounds a day to keep this war funded. Now this is an important question because people are organising against the cuts. We've heard earlier that some of the major unions in this country have come out against the bombing of Libya, including Unison, including Unite, the biggest union in the country, and including the PCS, which passed the Civil Servants Union, who are on strike later this month over their pensions, and who quite rightly want to know why there isn't money for their pensions, but there is money to spend on bombing Libya. But this also raises a challenge for us, because people very often say that, you know, there's so many calls on people's time now that people are campaigning against the cuts, they're doing all these different things. We have campaigns against unemployment, we have campaigns over student fees, we have campaigns over these things. How do people have enough time to campaign against the war? And this is an argument that comes up time and time again. I'd like to say two reasons why it is a false argument to counterpose these things. The one is that we live in an imperialist country, and we should never forget the history of our country, which is a history absolutely soaked in blood and with an absolutely long, hundreds of years of exploiting and occupying countries and treating their populations as though they were just there to serve the British Empire. The word jingoism, you know, people talk about jingoism, this kind of nationalist, militarist kind of view. The word jingoism comes from a music hall song which was composed in 1878. It's a song which says, if I remember rightly, it says, "We don't want to fight," which they always say, don't they? "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we've got the guns, we've got the men, we've got the money too." Now that was at the height of the British Empire, but it was also at a time when they were facing economic crisis. And interestingly, when they faced this economic crisis in the 1870s and the 1880s, what do? They turned to war in Afghanistan. They turned to war in the Sudan, where General Gordon was killed at Khartoum. A great jingoistic upset was created in the new mass media around this. This is what they turned towards. We know in the 1930s, when they faced economic crisis, they turned to war. They turned to war, obviously, with Hitler invaded more and more places, but also the war in Spain, the war in Abyssinia, the war in Manchuria, all of these wars. And therefore, imperialism and economic crisis and the fight against our government is not something which is separate, it's something which is totally connected. And it isn't true that once there's an economic crisis, these wars diminish. Actually, the wars grow and they expand precisely because of the problems that the different imperial powers have in competing with each other. And that is what we are seeing today again. That even though all of these wars are a failure, and the Libya war will be a failure in its own terms, as well as in terms of anything that any decent human being should want to support, they continue to conduct these wars, despite the human and financial costs that the wars create. And of course, they don't just create the human cost for people in Afghanistan, in Libya and elsewhere. The ideology behind these wars is the one which has directly created this wave of Islamophobia which is now going through Europe and America, and which is talking about women not having the right to wear hijabs or niqabs if they don't want to, talking about Muslims not having the right to do what they want to do. All of this is very, very much connected. So it seems to me that for all these reasons, we have to commit to rebuilding this movement. You know, 10 years is a very long time. And when you are involved in a campaign for 10 years, sometimes it feels like a very, very long time indeed. And all of us are 10 years older. All of us have been doing it. Luckily, there's a lot of young people here who also haven't been doing it for 10 years and who are going to do it in the future, I hope. And I think the young people, the students, the school students, are very, very much the hope of the future for all of us. But we all have to go away from this conference, hopefully armed with the arguments about why these wars are wrong, why it is that we should oppose them, but most importantly, in my opinion, why we should do something about it. You know, anti-imperialism isn't just a lifestyle choice. You know, I don't like the government, I don't like what they do in these wars. It's also about saying, what are we going to do about it? And whether it's at a low level, as it is at the moment over Libya, getting people to organise around this, or whether we can get it at a much higher level, which I believe we can over the next few months, we have to go away and say we are going to mobilise, we are going to demonstrate, we are going to hold meetings, we are going to have the petitions, we are going to occupy Trafalgar Square, we are going to do all of these things. And therefore, what I'd like to ask people to do is to take all the materials away, is to begin the campaigning for October the 8th. It's a very, very important date in our calendar, and as David said, will we support the American comrades in their fight? Of course we will support them, of course we wish them well, and I think the best support we can give them is not, if we want to go to Washington, all well and good, but is by what we do here in terms of building the movement here, because this has to be an international movement. Our two countries, the United States and Britain, are the two greatest war criminals in the world. They're the two biggest imperialists in the world. That is why we need a mass, vibrant anti-war movement which can deal not just with the wars of the past, but the wars that we're already facing and the wars of the future.